This is Amy from Noble Character Crafts, and today I'm going to share with you how I knit my socks 2 at a time. That's my preference in making socks always, to make them 2 at a time. I just find it so much easier to make both socks at once so that I can be ensured that they are going to match as far as the number of rounds that I am doing and so forth. So I've had a few requests of people asking me to share how I knit my socks 2 at a time. And that is what I'm going to show you today. I'm getting ready to start a new pair of socks. And so I thought I might as well just share with you how I do it. So I'll go over the supplies that I need. Today I'm going to be starting a pair of socks using some self-striping yarn. I have these little cakes left over from a project that I recently finished. I recently just wound them up into 2 cakes that are pretty much equal in measurement. There's about a little over 60 grams of yarn left over here from my previous project. It is Paintbox Yarn's socks in the Stripes Candy colorway. This is fingering weight, 75% wool, 25% polyamide. And then I'm also going to be using some Knit Picks Stroll fingering weight in the Paisley Heather colorway I think I'm going to use this for cuffs, heels, and toes in these socks since I only have 60 grams of the self-striping yarn. This is also fingering weight, 75% fine superwash merino wool and 25% nylon. The needles that I use are ChowGoo red lace. I use US 0 2mm needles for my socks because I am quite a loose knitter. And so I go down to a US 0. So I have this set of ChowGoo US 0 2mm needles on a 40-inch cord. And then I also will be using a pair of double pointed needles, also in US 0 2mm. That is just for my cast on. I use these to help me cast on. I also use a crochet hook for picking up my gusset stitches when I finish my heel. I use a small crochet hook to pick up my gusset stitches. And then I just have some light bulb stitch markers, as well as a tapestry needle for when I need to Kitchener my toes, and of course a pair of scissors. I think those are all of the supplies that I use. I hope I haven't forgotten anything, but as we go along, if I remember anything else that I need, then I will, of course, let you know. So the way that I start off my socks, I like to cast on over 2 needles because I have found that when I cast on, especially for socks, I'm going to be knitting these from the cuff to the toe. And I found that when I cast on, sometimes if I only cast on 1 needle, then my cuff is a bit too tight and I like it to be extra stretchy. So I cast on over 2 needles. So the way I'm going to start these is I'm going to cast on, I also only cast on 60 stitches for my socks, which of course can vary according to what works for your size of foot. But I have found, again, with my loose knitting, that 60 stitches works great for me. So I'm going to start with a long piece of yarn here, and I hold my 2 needles together, and I use a German twisted cast on. So this isn't a tutorial for the German twisted cast on, but I just do that again to get some extra stretch with my cast on. And I'm going to cast on 60 stitches over these 2 needles. Okay, I have cast on 60 stitches. Now, no matter what number of stitches that you cast on, it doesn't matter whether you need more or less than 60. The method that I will show you can be used for any number of stitches. So next I'm just going to pull out one of my needles and let the other one come through, and then I'm going to count across to half of my stitch count to be able to divide the 2 sides for magic loop. So I'm going to count across to 30. And I'm going to pull my loop through. So this one sock is cast on, and I'm just going to set it aside, and now I'm going to go on to use my double pointed needles for the second sock. I am now going to cast on the second sock using the 2 DPNs in the same way. I'm just going to cast on 60 stitches over these 2 needles. All right, I have now cast on 60 stitches over the 2 DPNs, and now I'm going to count across to the halfway point on these. Now I find this maybe the trickiest part, well, one of the trickiest parts maybe, of starting my socks 2 at a time. Here is my halfway point. I've spread my stitches apart a little bit there, and I'm going to pull the 2 needles apart from each other. Oh, and I've kind of closed up my little gap there. But I want to split half of my stitches onto one DPN and half onto the other. So I just carefully slide one DPN over and poke it through where that halfway mark is, and then slide the other one the other way. Like that. So I have my 30 stitches on each of my DPNs now. And I'm going to orient these DPNs so that the tails from my cast on here are hanging off the right side of the needle that is furthest away from me. I'm going to carefully just set those down like that. And I'm going to grab my longer circular needles, and I'm going to orient those stitches in the same way. So I want these stitches lined up in the same way with, well, I want to make sure my stitches aren't getting twisted, of course, and I want, again, my thread, my tails here, to be on the back needle, or the one that's furthest away from me, and hanging to the right when I'm looking at my work. And that way, these are both lined up in the same way, and they're kind of matching. And now I want to move the stitches that are on this back DPN, the one with the tails. I want to move those stitches onto this same back needle on my magic loop, so that those stitches are then onto this needle. So I find it easiest for some reason to do it backwards. So I'm going to pick up this back DPN and switch my work around. And so now I've got my back needle on both. Here's my tail on my magic loop, and I've got my tail on my DPN hanging off to the left now since I've turned it around. And I'm just going to transfer these stitches over to my magic loop circular needles here. Okay, they are all onto the longer circular needle. I'm done with this 1 DPN. I don't need that anymore for the rest of the project. And I'm ready to actually start knitting now in the round. I'm just gonna knit this first round, and that's gonna get rid of this second DPN. So first I want to pull my, well, I've turned it around. I didn't mention that, but you might have noticed I just turned it around again so that, again, my tail is hanging off the back of my needles. I'm going to pull that back needle out to start working magic loop. So I'm going to pull that long, and I'm going to start working into the DPN, the stitches that are on the DPN right now. And I'm going to start my first round. I knit my cuffs by doing knit 2, purl 1 across. That just works really well for my 60 stitch count. But of course, no matter what ribbing you are doing, it doesn't matter. The method will work the same. I do just like to double check to make sure my stitches didn't get twisted. And go ahead and knit across the first 30 stitches on your first sock here. Okay, I've knitted those stitches onto the long circular needle, and I am now done with the second DPN as well. And again, I won't need that one anymore either. So now I'm ready to start my second sock. And I'll just slide. Actually, I'm going to trim my extra tail on this because it's a little longer than what I like. I like it to only be about 4 inches long, and that can get a bit of a that can get to be a bit of a tangled mess if it's too long. So I'm going to snip that extra long tail off of that one. And I might trim this first sock's tail down too. Okay, so now I'm ready to start the second sock. And again, I just like to make sure my stitches are lined up correctly. And your yarn will just be coming from the back of the cord here. And I'll go ahead and knit across these for my ribbing. All right, I finished the first half of my second sock ribbing, and now it's time to turn my work around. And I'm gonna pull my back needle into the stitches here. And since I've turned my needle, now that front needle that I had at first is now the back needle. I'm gonna pull that long and try to keep this sorted. And I'm gonna go ahead and work across the second half of my second sock. Done with my second sock on the first round here, and I'm gonna finish up the first sock, the second half of the first sock. And I finished across the second half of my first sock with that first row of ribbing. Now, whenever you're turning your work, you do want to keep an eye on your yarn just so that it doesn't get to be a complete tangled mess. If you're able to keep track of which way you've turned it, some people I have heard say whenever they're working across the front of their sock, they'll turn their work clockwise, and then when they finish working across the back of their sock, they'll turn it counterclockwise. I'm never with it or never pay attention enough to keep track of that. I just keep an eye on my yarn and I look at it and make sure it's not twisted, and if it is, then I untwist it. But anyway, so if you're able to keep track of that a little bit better, probably you won't get into a tangle ever. But once in a while, my yarns get all twisted around and I just untwist them. So that's pretty much it. I continue to work magic loop 2 at a time. I can go across one more round, but it's pretty self-explanatory, I think, at this point. So you just want to make sure that you're always picking up the yarn that, of course, is attached to the sock that you want to work on. But you're going to go across your right side, or the front of your sock on your first sock, the front of your sock on your second sock, the back of your sock on your second sock, and then the back of your sock on your first sock. And I'm going to continue with my ribbing for probably 20 rounds. All right, I have now finished knitting my cuffs. I did, I think, 20 rounds of the 2x1 ribbing, but another nice thing with knitting your socks 2 at a time is even if you miscount your ribbing, they're going to be matching. So that's another thing that I just love about knitting socks 2 at a time, is that I don't have to worry about getting off on my counting because I just know they're going to match. So I'm going to do contrast cuffs, heels, and toes, as I already mentioned. So I'm just going to cut out this Paisley Heather colorway. And I want my stripes to match with the color striping yarn. So I usually pull from the outside, but I think for this time I'm going to pull from the inside of these because it looks like the color, I really don't want to have this bright pink next to the purple because there's not a whole lot of contrast with those two colors. So I want to go from the inside, I think, to see if I can use those stripes a little bit better. So what I do is I just look at the color repeat, and I think I want to pull this one out to get to the color that will match, but we'll see how this goes. It's a little bit of a trial and error process, I think. Because this one I have like a light blue color. Oh, that's going to purple. So I'm not sure. Maybe it's this one I want to pull out. Okay, that one's going back to that bright pink. So what do I want to do? I think, let me look at the color stripe from my gnome that I made using this yarn. So if you're using a yarn that you're not really sure how it's going to stripe up exactly, you might have to really look carefully at the color striping. But I made this gnome using, you can't probably see it really well, but if you've watched one of my previous episodes where I showed what I've been making, I made this gnome and its hat is made using the color striping yarn. So I can see the color repeat a little bit better on this. And this one went from, let's see, I'm gonna get a tangled mess here. This one went from white to purple. So that's right here at the end of the hat. And then this one was going into the pink, and it started with the blue. So I'm gonna pull out the blue and the pink from this one so I can get to the white stripe, and then I'll start with that one on both of them, I think. There's the white. So actually now what I wanna do is continue pulling out the white until I get to the lighter purple, because I want my white stripes to match. And I am not sure if, I don't think that's probably a full color stripe of the white from the first skein that I pulled out here. So I'm going to pull it out until I get the lighter purple, which comes next. Okay, there we go. And I want to line up my two yarns so that that color change is matching. So hopefully you can see that the cream color is, I'll get rid of my gnome now. The cream color is transitioning over to the light purple stripe. So I'm just going to keep those lined up and pull out my yarn so that I have two, so that my two white strands are exactly even. Because I wonder if that first one was not a full color stripe. I'm not sure. Okay, so pretty close. It's pretty close. The pink stripe is just a few inches away, but I'm going to cut these so that they match exactly. I'm going to get rid of that little ball from the one that I pulled all of that color out of. I just have this little ball. I don't need to use that in these socks. So that'll go in my scraps. And I'm going to actually wind this around the outside of these cakes just so that those long tails don't get tangled up. Okay, I have kind of rewound up those last few stripes that I'm going to start with, and I'm going to go ahead and add them into my socks. This isn't any different than any other, obviously you're just continuing with this procedure of knitting the socks two at a time, but I thought I would just share with you how I start out using color striping yarn to make sure that my socks match. And of course now maybe not of course, but I'm going to be knitting a pair of plain stockinette socks, but no matter if you're using a pattern or just doing plain stockinette, you will be able to follow the same procedure for knitting socks two at a time, of course. And another nice thing about knitting, if you are going to do a pattern, again, if you make a mistake in your pattern on one sock, you'll probably make it on the second sock as well. So again, there's just a more likelihood that your socks will be matching. I just like having the stress off of, because I really like having matching socks, so I like having the stress off of me to worry about making sure both of my socks match. Or even if I make a modification to one sock, I don't have to worry about thinking about adding that into the second sock, because I can just do it all at once, which I really like doing it that way. So I usually knit quite a long leg on my socks. I usually make 70 rounds of plain stockinette, or even if I am following a pattern, I usually make the leg 70 more rounds after my 20 round cuff. So I have a total of 90 rounds for my socks. That's just my preference. So no matter what length of a leg that you prefer, you can just continue knitting your socks to whatever length you like. And the next thing that I'll show you is starting the slip stitch heel flap, which is the heel that I usually add to my socks. So you can just go ahead and continue knitting your socks however you like, however long you like them to be, and I will meet you back here when you're ready to start your heel flaps. Okay, I have made it through the length of my legs as long as I want to make them. I just counted and I've done 68 rows or rounds on my legs. I typically do around 70 rounds, but with self-striping yarn, I like to start my heel flap at a color change. Now, typically with self-striping yarn, my color changes do get off a little bit. So even though they're supposed to be matching, inevitably, whether it be my gauge isn't perfect, of course, or maybe the yarn isn't perfect either, inevitably the color changes get off a little bit. So one sock will change color before the other sock typically, but this one is quite extreme, unfortunately. On my first sock here, it's already changed to a new color stripe on the second half of the back of this sock. And then the second sock here still has probably enough yarn to do another round before it changes to the new color. So that's really unfortunate. I usually like to leave my self-striping yarn attached when I'm making self-striping socks, and then I typically will knit my heels in a contrast color, but I won't cut my main color of the self-striping yarn. But in this case, I'm actually going to have to cut both if I want them to be matching. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut this one that still has a lot of this last color that I've already knitted. I'm going to go ahead and cut that. And then when I start it back up, I'm going to start with the pinky purple color here. On this one, I was thinking of just leaving that because my heel contrast color is very, very close to that color, but it's not a great match. And I think that's going to bother me to have a few stitches in this other color. So I'm going to actually knit back and undo those stitches and start my contrast color for these few stitches, and it will blend in with the heel flap, so you won't really be able to tell, I don't think. It's kind of unfortunate because I was kind of hoping to be able to show you how I typically do my heels, and this isn't typical for me where I have to cut my yarns. I usually, like I said, keep them attached. But anyway, I'm going to go ahead and tink back on this row and cut out that color change. Now that I think about it, I think I'm going to actually tink back on this other sock as well so that I can start both of my heels with the contrast color at the exact same point. Okay, I have gotten to the same spot on both socks now. I'm just going to trim this one down. Now, like I said, this isn't typical for me. Normally when I start my heel flaps, I complete a round. and I start, so this is my beginning of round on this side. And I typically start my heel flap doing a purl row on the back of my sock for my heel flaps, which is different than most sock patterns. Most sock patterns call for you to start your heel flap on the right side or on a knit side. But I typically don't, because then I can leave my yarn attached like I mentioned. And then when I'm done with my heel flap and turn, after I pick up the gusset stitches on the first side of my socks, then I can cut my contrast color for my heel flap and just continue with my main color. But for this one, I'm going to be doing it differently since I had to cut my yarn anyway. So I am on, this is the back side of my sock, so you can see the beginning of round where my tails are hanging off at the beginning of the cuffs here. And I'm going to start now with a knit, well, I'm doing a slip stitch heel flap, so I'm going to be on the slip one, knit one row to start off my heel flaps. I do make one bit of a modification when I do my heel flaps. When I start each right side row, I slip the first stitch knitwise rather than purlwise. I think I learned that tip from Kay of the Bakery Bears. I think I heard her say that one time, that she does that, and it is supposed to make it easier to pick up your stitches when you get to your gusset flap, I get, or your gusset stitches, I guess. So I have just done that for a long time now. Anyway, I'm going to be doing a slip one, knit one across. And for the second sock, well, actually it's the first sock on the needles, but anyway, since I'm on the back of the sock, the next one, some people do their heel flaps separately when they're doing socks 2 at a time, but I like to do my heel flaps also at the same time. So that's what I will show you. Okay, my right side is finished, and now I'm just going to flip my work over and do the wrong side, or the purl side. And for this, I just slip the first one purlwise and then purl straight across. When knitting the heel flaps, I do recommend that you do not stop when you're in between the two socks. Now, if you're using a contrast color like I am, it's not as difficult to tell where you're at, because you can, probably count your rows that you've worked. But if you're not using a contrast color, I've found that it's really difficult to tell where I'm at if I stop in the middle. It's hard for me to tell if I should be knitting the right side of this sock or the wrong side of this sock. So I always try to not stop in the middle of these two socks when I'm doing the heel flaps. All right, I have finished my wrong side row for my heel flaps. I am going to continue knitting those 2 rows for a total of 32 rows for my heel flap, but of course you do whatever works for your socks best. And I will complete those 32 rows, and then I will meet you back here to show you how I knit my heel turns. I have just finished my 32 rows of my heel flaps, and I am about to start working the heel turns. Now for the heel turns, I do have to do those one at a time. So the way that I work it, I'm looking obviously at the back of my socks right now. So this is the second sock when looking at the right side. This is the first sock. And I work my second sock's heel turn first. I do the complete heel turn, and then I'll go on to the first socks. So I'll show you the process of that. For my heel turn, I start with a slip stitch. Again, I slip that knitwise, and then I knit across 15 stitches. So I have a total of 16 stitches on my right hand needle before I do my first turn, since I started with a total of 30 stitches. That's what I do. So I'll go ahead and work halfway across my heel flap here, or my heel. Yeah, across my heel flap. That's what I meant to say. And then I do a slip knit. I do my slip knit a little differently than most. I learned this technique from Patty Lyons, and it helps my slip knit stitches to be a little bit tighter. I also pull that extra tight on my heel flap, knit one more stitch, and I pull that stitch extra tight as well, because I have a tendency to get some loose stitches on that part of my heel flap. And then on the wrong side, I will slip one stitch purlwise and knit only purl only 3 stitches. And then purl 2 together. And purl 1 more. And turn. And I'll continue doing my heel flap construction like that. So I I only slip the first stitch knitwise. Otherwise, I slip the stitches purlwise. So slip it purlwise, and then knit to the gap and knit to, or do the SSK stitch again. This is not, a tutorial on how to do a heel flap, but I just wanted to show how I do that. So I'm going to go ahead and finish out my heel turn on this first sock, and I'll meet you back here. I'm just on my last few rows of my first heel turn, and since I have only 30 stitches on one half of my sock, it kind of changes the way that my heel flap ends, or my heel turn ends. So I am at my last gap where I need to do a slip knit stitch, and that actually finishes out my row. I don't have one extra knit stitch to knit, which you would have if you had 32 stitches on the back of your sock, for example. But I just end with a slip knit on that row, and then on the final purl row, I don't slip the first stitch, I purl across, and then I'll end with my purl 2 together to close up the last gap. Then I'm just going to knit across this. I've finished my heel turn, and I'm just going to knit across the stitches. I have a total of 16 stitches on my needle at this point. So now it's time for me to pick up the first half of my gusset stitches on this the second sock, but the first one I'm working on. I like to use a small crochet hook. I have a 2.25 millimeter crochet hook. Technically, my knitting needles are 2.0 millimeter, but I don't think I have a crochet hook that's a 2 millimeter, so I use this one and it's just fine. You don't have to use a crochet hook, of course. I just find that it's easier to pick up my stitches this way. So I pick up a total of 17 stitches for my gusset stitches. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. For that 17th stitch, I find it is easy to make a hole when you're picking up that 17th stitch, so I do that a little bit differently. I pick up the leg of this stitch from kind of the row below right here. I hope you can see what I'm doing. I pick up the left leg of that stitch, and then I kind of go into that spot as well. I hope you can kind of see what I've done there for that 17th stitch. I go under 2 stitches really and grab it that way, and that helps to kind of twist those stitches so that I don't get as bad of a hole on that 17th stitch. I hope that's clear. Then I just slide these stitches onto my knitting needle from the end of my crochet hook, which works really well. They are twisted, by the way, though, so when I slip them onto my knitting needle, I twist them back the way they should go. So I pick up the the leg that's on the back here, and I flip it around as I move it over to my knitting needle. And after I have those gusset stitches picked up, I go ahead and cut my contrast color. For that first heel turn that I did. I'm all done with that yarn on that sock. And like I mentioned before I started my heel flap, I would normally have my main color hanging out right here, and so I can just usually pick it up, but I had to cut my yarn on the other side, so it didn't work out for these socks. But typically I would have my main color waiting for me to pick up there. But anyway, I will now go on. So this first heel turn that I worked, again, is on the second sock that's on my needles when looking at the right side. So I've worked the heel turn, and I've picked up 1/2 of the gusset stitches on this second sock. Now I'm going to go to the first sock, and I'm going to do the exact same thing. So I'm going to work the heel turn and pick up my gusset stitches, and I'll meet you back here after I've gotten to that point. But again, just repeating what I've already done on this second sock, now on the first sock. All right, I have just picked up the gusset stitches on this first sock. I can go ahead and cut this contrast yarn as well. All done with that. I'm going to use the contrast again for the toes, but now I can go ahead and switch back to my self-striping yarn and see if I can get these two to start matching again instead of being off by quite so much. So I'm just going to go ahead and snip these so that they are the same length, and hopefully we'll be back on track. We'll see if the color stripes will stay together or not. It's not likely, but we'll see. So now I am ready to knit across the top of the sock again on the, the front of the sock. And I'm just going to knit across both of these socks with the main color of yarn. All right, I've knit across the front of both of my socks with my main color, and now I'm going to flip them around, and I'm going to pick up the gusset stitches on the second sock, on the second side of the second sock. And again, I'll pick up 17 gusset stitches on this side. Okay, I've picked up 17 stitches for my other side of my gusset stitches, and I'm going to pull the needle that is on the other side, holding my front stitches. I'm going to pull that long and switch my stitches from the crochet hook, twisting them back over onto the knitting needle. And now I've picked up all of my stitches for the back side of this second sock. I have a total of 50 stitches now on the back of my sock. I'm going to knit across the rest of these stitches, but when I come to the last 3 stitches, I'm going to do my first gusset decrease, doing a knit 2 together. When I get to the last 3 stitches, I'll knit 2 together and then knit the last stitch. Okay, here I am at my last 3 stitches, knit 2 together, and knit the last stitch. That's a loose stitch from the end of round there. So pull that tight. And now I'm ready to do the same thing on my first sock. So last time picking up gusset stitches, I'll go ahead and do the same thing on this sock. So I'll pick up 17 stitches on this side of my heel flap, and then I'll knit across the rest of the stitches, and again at the last 3 I will knit 2 together and knit the very last one, and I'll meet you back here again at that point. Okay, I'm again at the last 3 stitches on my first sock. I'm going to knit those 2 together and knit the last one again. Okay, so at this point I'm all done using my crochet hook. I can get rid of that. I don't need the scissors right now either, but at this point I like to use a stitch marker to mark which side of the gusset stitches I need to decrease. So like you saw, I just did a knit 2 together on this side of my gusset decreases. I'm going to knit across the front of my socks again, and then when I get over to this side I will do a slip slip knit decrease on both of my socks. And so I like to mark my second sock with a light bulb stitch marker, and then every time I get to the right side of my socks I move that from either this side where I do a slip slip knit stitch or to the other side of my second sock here where I do a knit 2 together, because I have just found that helps me to keep track of where I'm at in my gusset decreases. So I always keep a stitch marker on my heel flap to indicate which side of the heel flap am I doing a decrease. Every time I knit across the back side of my socks, I'm doing a decrease on one side or the other. And so I just use the stitch marker to help me remember which side I'm decreasing on. So I'll go ahead and knit across the front of these stitches. You may find that when you have all of, there are quite a lot of stitches on this back side of your socks now at this point. So it is it takes a little more effort to pull your cord through, but it's not, I don't think it's that unbearable. So now I'm on the back side and I'm going to knit the first stitch and then slip slip knit. And knit to the end of this sock. And I will repeat that on the next sock as well, of course. Knit the first one, slip slip knit, and knit across to the end. All right, I've finished that round, and now I'm back on the front stitches, and at this point I like to switch my stitch marker to the other side of my sock. I always keep it on this second sock just because that's the sock I'm doing the decreases on first. So I just always keep it on this sock and I just flip it back and forth depending on what round I'm on. So I'm going to continue in this manner until I have decreased all of my gusset stitches, meaning that then I will have 30 stitches again on the back of each of my needles here for the back of each of my sock. So I'll have a total of 60 stitches back again on my socks, 30 on the front and the back. So I will continue doing this and I'll meet you back here, but actually at that point there's not much more to do. You're just going to continue knitting in the round, 30 stitches on, each front sock and 30 stitches on each back sock, and you'll be knitting your feet to the length that you need them. I guess I probably will just continue doing that until I get to the beginning of the ball of my foot, which if you've watched my other videos before, maybe you've seen that I always add in a slip stitch section on the ball of my socks. So anyway, go ahead and do your gusset decreases until they are back to your regular stitch count, and then knit your socks to the length that you want. If you want to see how I insert a reinforcement section in the balls of my socks, then I will show you that when I get to that point. All right, I have been working on the foot section of my socks, and I have keep count of the length of my feet by marking them with a removable stitch marker every 20 rounds. So from the end of the heel flap, which is a little bit difficult to see because the color transition isn't great between the heel turn and then just knitting in the round. I was doing the gusset decreases in this section. But anyway, I count from the end of the heel turn. Every 20 rounds, I put a light bulb stitch marker. And for my length of foot, I knit 50 rounds total. And that gets me to the section right before the balls of my foot. So once in a while, I'll just try on my socks as I'm knitting them to make sure that I'm at that right spot. But if you would like to try this reinforced section that I add to the balls of my socks to help reinforce the ball section of my socks, that's where I tend to wear holes in my socks most quickly. And so I'm going to show you how I add in that reinforced section on the balls of my foot. Anyway, I have found that knitting 50 rounds in plain stockinette gets me to right before the ball of my foot. So I just want to show you how I do that. Now, I actually have done that on the heel flap, and I think maybe a little bit of this section of a sock before too, in the bottom of the heel. If that's a section where you may wear a hole in your sock more quickly, you can really add this type of a reinforced section into wherever you tend to wear holes in your socks most quickly. I just wanted to show you how I add in this slip stitch section in the balls of my socks. So I do that for the last 30 rounds of my foot before I do my toe decreases. So like I said, I've already knit 50 rounds and now I'm going to do 30 rounds of a slip stitch section. The way that I do that is I simply slip one and knit one across, and I'm already on the bottom of my foot. I already knit straight across the top of these socks. So this is now my 51st round. And I just simply go across with a slip one, knit one. And I will do that across only the bottom of the socks. Across the tops of the socks, I will just knit plain stockinette. So I'll go ahead and finish off this sock. I will do the same on the second sock. All right, I finished that first sock with slip one, knit one across, and I'll do the same on the second sock. Okay, I've done the slip one, knit one across the bottom of both socks, and now I'm just going to knit in plain stockinette across the tops. I am on the bottom of my socks again. This is now the second row of this slip stitch section, and I'm simply going to knit across all of these stitches. When you're doing this slip stitch section, if you ever lose track of which row you're on, whether you're on a slip stitch row or a plain knit row, you can tell by this first stitch. You can really see that that first stitch has been slipped because the yarn misses that first stitch. So that's an easy cue to keep in mind if you have a hard time keeping track of what row you're on, which happens to me quite often. And then when you're ready to do another slip row, you'll easily be able to tell that that first stitch has been knitted if you look carefully at it. Also, I did want to make a note, if you are adding this slip stitch section to socks using self-striping yarn, you will probably notice a difference in the length of your stripes. Because you are slipping many stitches, then your stripes, you're not using up as much yarn as you normally would, and therefore your stripes are going to be a little bit thicker than they would normally be. Also, I should mention that sometimes people have an issue with doing a slip stitch heel flap and gusset using self-striping yarn because they say it disrupts the length of the stripes, the width of the stripes. But I really don't find that it's very significant at all. With this colorway, each color stripe is approximately 10 rounds. The first stripe after when I was doing the Gusset Decreases, the first stripe, which is this bright pink stripe, went down to 8 rows instead of 10. And then the next white stripe here was 9 rows. And by that, that's all the length that I needed. I think I was done with my Gusset Decreases maybe a couple rows into this light purple color. But anyway, it only slightly made this bright pink stripe thinner, but it was only by 2 rounds, and I don't think it's that significant, so it doesn't make much of a difference in my opinion. Now I also will use one of my removable stitch markers and mark the front of my sock now. It's a little bit harder to keep count, I think, of the rows when on the bottom of this sock when I'm doing that slip stitch section, so I like to mark the end, you know, my 50th round here on the front of my sock, so then I can keep track of needing 30 more rounds before I'll do my toe decreases. But you just need to repeat those 2 rounds. So you just, on the bottom of your foot, do slip 1, knit 1 across, and then on the second row you just knit across, and then repeat those 2 rounds. I repeat those 2 rounds for a total of 30 rounds before I'm ready to do my toe decreases. So I'll go ahead and do that and meet you back here when I am ready to start my toe decreases. Okay, I have finished the foot section of my socks. I'm ready to start my toes. As you can see, in the last section that I recorded, I had put a light bulb stitch marker on my 50th round. Again, I used a light bulb stitch marker to mark 20 rounds. Like I had said, I do a total of 30 rounds for the slip stitch detail on the ball of my feet, which you can see here. So that's what that section looks like. It does kind of pull in the stitches in this section. That reinforcement, those slip stitches just do that. I dropped a stitch right here, which I just noticed, so I used another stitch marker to grab that, and I'll pick that up on my next round. But I am now ready to cut off my main color, which you can see I only have these 2 little bits left of my main color, basically just that bright pink color again, which I ended up only using 1 time on the, just right after the heel. And I have just a little bit left of this light blue color to finish off. So that works great, I think, because my contrast color is really similar to that bright pink color. So anyway, I think it'll work great to just switch over to my contrast color now. So I'm gonna go ahead and cut out my main color on both of these. So I am ready to start the toes. I can't remember now if I've mentioned before, but my base recipe or pattern that I follow is Kayla Litton's free sock pattern. So she has free patterns for how to knit socks on Magic Loop, and I basically follow her instructions, but of course I do a 60 stitch count and she does not provide that. She has 56 stitches or 64 stitches, so I do have to make a few modifications. But the toes, you'll notice the way that I knit my toes is very, very similar to what she provides in her free patterns. So I'll definitely link to her tutorials in the description box below if you want to check that out, because I highly recommend her patterns. So I am just going to start off with a decrease round where you knit 1 and then slip, slip, knit across to the last 3 stitches. And once you get to the last 3 stitches, I knit 2 together and knit the last stitch. I'll repeat that all the way around on all 4 sides of each, on both sides of each sock. So there's a total of, 8 sets of decreases for both socks, if that makes sense. I've just finished that first decrease round, and then my next round will just be plain knitting. Another little tip that I like to do is I grab something, sometimes it's a little ruler, or a lot of times it's one of these tape measures, and I grab one that has writing on one side and is plain on the other, And that way I can just keep track more easily of what round I'm on, if I'm on a decrease round or a plain knitting round. So when I'm on a decrease round, I always flip it so that I can see the words. Here's another plug for Crazy Sock Lady. I can see the words and then I remember I'm on a decrease round. And then when I'm on a plain knitting round, I flip it over. And it's just kind of a visual aid that I like to use so that I can just easily knit my decreases without forgetting which round I'm on. I mean, you can look carefully or count your stitches if you keep track of where you started your toe decreases, but this is just a tool that I use to help me keep track. So I will continue, the next round will be plain knitting, and I'll continue with those 2 rounds, decrease, plain knitting, until I have 16 stitches on each side. So a total of 32 stitches for each sock. And then I will do decrease rounds for every round until I only have a total of 16 stitches. So 8 stitches on each side of the sock. And then I will be ready to do the Kitchener stitch to close up my toes. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I will continue with decreasing every other round, again, until I have a total of 32 stitches. And then I will decrease every round until I have a total of 16 stitches. And I will meet you back here to show you how I Kitchener my toes. Okay, I have just finished knitting my toe decreases and I'm ready to Kitchener my toes shut. So I'm going to cut a length of yarn about, I don't know, 10 inches long, perhaps. Maybe you can't see that on the screen, but about this long on both of the socks. And now I'll use a tapestry needle and I will use the Kitchener stitch to bind off the 16 stitches on each sock, and I'll just do the first sock completely and then I'll move on to the second sock. So this isn't, you know, a tutorial about how to do a Kitchener stitch. You can find those other places, but I thought I would just share from start to finish how I knit my socks, and this is usually how I finish off my socks. Okay, I finished binding off those stitches with the Kitchener stitch, and I'll go ahead and weave in all of these ends. On this sock, I do have quite a few because, well, not a ton, but quite a few. So I'll have this one on the toe, and then I've got the one at the beginning, of course, where I first changed. I have a couple at the heel. I also have where I changed my color at the toe, and then the last one on the toe. So I have a few of those extra yarn ends to weave in as well, but I'll go ahead and do my second sock just like I did my first one, and then I'll be pretty much done. I am all finished. I just Kitchenered the toes and wove in all of the ends, and they are done. I hope that this video was helpful for you. I hope that it gave you a little bit of insight into the way that I knit my socks, and I hope that it was clear and understandable. Thank you so much for joining me. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.